Can you see my screen okay? Great.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So proposals. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about a piece of organizational culture that's grown up in data engineering over the past few years. I feel like I've talked to a lot of people about it. We've kind of talked about it as a group a bit. And so hearing things like, that sounds like it needs a proposal is pretty common already. But I want to dig into it a little bit more since I don't think it's always clear why this is being asked or what it means or why it's worth the effort. So first things first, what is a proposal? At its core, there's three components to it: a problem statement, a description of the solution you plan to use, and a process for including people. There's lots of names for things related to this: the RFC, request for comment process, architectural decision records, product requirements docs, design docs, intent to prototype, so on and so forth. This is kind of like the simplest possible version of the good parts of those things. Okay, so why are these three things important? The proposals help to make sure you're solving the right problem in the right way and being inclusive of your excellent colleagues. So let's take a little bit of closer look at what this process looks like. So here's a timeline. It's a generic timeline. How long it takes can vary, but the stages are roughly these. First stage is you have an idea. So this is help, like in your mind, clarifying the problem. You can write it down, you can make a mess, you can clean it up. And yeah, again, splitting the problem from the solution here is super useful. So I think I do this in one-on-ones with a lot of people, is present a very poorly formed idea and workshop it a little bit to get it to something that makes sense. So that's the first step. And then after that, shop it around with a small group of people, people either pretty close or familiar with the problem domain, or people you just trust for good feedback. And this is the time at which it is the cheapest possible moment to do course corrections. You haven't invested much in an implementation yet, so you're open to changing both problem and solution. It's kind of a dry run to clarify things before you expand the audience. So once that stage looks pretty good, you move on to a broader dissemination of this proposal to, a team, stakeholders, peers, related teams. This is to gather discussion and feedback. And don't be afraid to overshare at this stage. Just make sure to include a very short, is this relevant to me preamble, so you can be respectful of people's time. And we'll come back to that in a minute. At this point, disagreement's great. So it's still cheap to course correct, and you can learn super valuable things. On the audience for this part, so expanding the audience, one way I found useful to identify the audience is thinking to yourself, who else might care? And that can lead to some people outside the team or people that you don't normally talk to or whatever, but people who might be impacted by this thing. That's a good way to think about who to share with. So the next stage of let's do this, major issues have been addressed, feedback has been incorporated. As an aside here, pro tip is that if you include a future work section, it's a nice antidote to scope creep, where you can say, yep, this is a great idea, we should do this at some point, set a scope right now, but you've still kind of captured that information and that feedback in a useful way that we can refer back to later, which again, I'll come back to. So yeah, once things feel pretty solid and alignment is relatively clear, share your intent to proceed with implementation and communicate any decisions that you've made along the way. Again, with that similar group or maybe a different group, this kind of varies depending on the scope of things. So last but not least, celebrate. So work towards milestones. A lot of the times things don't really end with done. So the data platform infrastructure, as my near and dear example, is never done, but you can be done with a phase of implementation or a milestone. And this is a good point at which to share progress with stakeholders and teams, let people know that your work is ready to use, so that, yeah, we can all move forward. And coming back to the timeline thing again for a second, the timeline here could be days long, it could be months long. The idea is to kind of keep things as lightweight as makes sense. So it's not meant to bog down your work. It's meant to gather feedback when reacting to that feedback is as cheap as possible. So here we're trying to guard against building the wrong thing in the wrong way and surprising people along the way. Okay, feedback. I mentioned that, probably said that word quite a few times by now. And aside from informing people about what you're proposing, gathering feedback is a key part of this process. And what you're trying to do is uncover unknowns and check in with other viewpoints. And the other side of that equation is giving good feedback, which is a skill that takes practice. Proposals give you a pretty good way to practice that and to observe how others do it and see, ask for help with moderation, all of those sorts of good things. And another important part of good feedback is that good feedback is timely. We've had good luck by time boxing requests for feedback to give you kind of a deadline by which we would like feedback. So it's not just like, yep, I'll get to that eventually. It's, I need to get to that by the end of next week or so forth, something like that. Again, when requesting feedback, going to an earlier point I talked about, is try to be as clear and succinct as possible about what kind of feedback you're looking for. If you're sharing broadly, you can include a this is of interest to you if line to say why you're sharing this with the audience. If you're targeting specific people or teams, you can say like feedback on a particular part of the implementation or from a particular point of view or use case. The goal is to be respectful of people's time and make it easy for them to decide whether and how to engage with a proposal. Right. When is a proposal needed is another question that comes up. You don't need it for every bug you work on or every JIRA ticket you take, but some guidelines for when you might need one and how to make that judgment call are when work will take more than a few days or require cross-team collaboration. When decisions you are trying to make would affect many people or affect people's workflows, or when the path is not totally clear. If you don't really know what the solution should be, a good way is to start with the problem and then start canvassing for thoughts on how to do it. So a couple of examples going from the very small. I used the proposal process to sketch out the data.org landing page on Mana, which is pretty easy to do. It was pretty easy to reach agreement on, but the proposal process was a helpful way to gather that feedback. Also, this whole proposal process, there was a proposal for it as well, kind of meta, but it was an interesting exercise in seeing whether the content was right at the time. So those are pretty small examples. For a larger example, the Shredder project for providing self-serve data deletion option to our users. The work spanned many, many months and is still ongoing, but it began as a proposal. And it was a worthwhile investment to make sure we're kind of doing the right thing up front when we knew it was going to be a pretty daunting and heavy project. And yeah, there's a bunch of other examples of that, which are linked to on Mana. There's a link in the deck. But yeah, so going back again to why, there's a lot of benefits to this process. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that are top of mind for me. So these are kind of like what you get in exchange or what we collectively get. So the first one is the proposal gives us sort of an async venue to canvas for feedback. A lot of times these things happen in meetings and discussions can happen in meetings, but they are subject to the whims of time zones and holidays and PTO and these sorts of things. So it can make it hard for people to contribute synchronously in things like Zoom meetings. This approach says that it allows people to respond on their own schedule and in ways that make sense to them. It's also easier to get feedback from more people than you can comfortably discuss a topic in the context of a meeting. Also, some people are, more or less comfortable with shouting their ideas into a large group of people all at once. So the different communication styles can be accommodated this way as well. So these all foster inclusion and let a broader variety of people participate in ways that work for them. Another key benefit is course corrections. So we can validate our assumptions early and change them easily. You can tweak the problem statement independent of the solution. So if you could say like, by making this change to the problem statement, we can solve this whole other class of things that's really valuable, or saying that's not quite the right thing. Or if people get super excited and say that's exactly the problem, let's do this with gusto, you can get alignment, and that's really helpful. But those course corrections, the earlier you get them, the easier they are to accommodate. So yeah, as an exercise in risk reduction, it increases the probability of doing the right thing. And a specific example of that was Chutton put together a proposal for Nimbus telemetry with Glean. And don't mind the telemetry highlight. That's just a weird thing that I have configured to notify me about in Slack. But yes, it resulted in a significant change in approach in the proposal. So I don't know if that's enough time to read through this whole thing. But yeah, to me, that's a great success where rather than investing a lot in the solution and the implementation, we can make sure we're aimed in the right direction early on. So nice work in that process. And yeah, that's to me, that's a big success of this process. Future reference and the scrolls of wisdom is another useful thing. Sometimes it's useful to revisit these decisions from the past. If there's a corresponding proposal that makes things super easy, you can kind of go and see what the discussion was about, what the problem framing was that resulted in the solution that we have. If the assumptions that we were working from at the time have changed, then we can change things in the future. An example here is the main ping table, which I think I've probably talked about too much over the past, but we had this trouble where 10,000 columns is a hard limit in BigQuery. It's not enough for what we wanted to do with the main ping. So we had two approaches we could use. One, split into multiple tables. The other, encode things in a different way. We have a proposal for one. We don't have a proposal for the other. So now that that restriction is lifted, it's a little bit harder to go and relitigate that decision. And if we'd done a proposal for both, it would be much easier to do. Spoiler alert, we do not need to revise all of our assumptions, so don't worry. And again, one thing that we've done is to enumerate all of these proposals in data engineering on a mana page, which is linked to in the speaker notes. So if you want to see examples, or if you're curious about why things are the way they are, there's a lot of background material there and examples that you can look at. So my ask to you, give it a try. Your vegetables are actually pretty tasty. There's a template doc, so I'm gonna put that together. So that makes it a little bit easier to get started. Typing is not usually the hardest part of this, but it is like a little bit of a lower barrier if there's a structure to put your thoughts and information into. And as a corollary here, I volunteer for that early feedback group for any proposal that any of y'all have and want some feedback on. So now it's my turn to ask for feedback. Now, I think we have a few minutes for questions, and if you have any, feel free to chime in.